Let's tell a story. 80 years ago, before he became United States President, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy was saved by an Australian bookkeeper turned World War II coast watcher during fighting in the Solomon Islands, Pacific Islands. It's the story of an unlikely hero that helped pave JFK's path to the White House. And Brett Mason has written it into a book called Saving Lieutenant Kennedy. So let's first of all clear a couple of things up. Is it correct that Lieutenant Kennedy was on a patrol boat known as PT-109?
You are dead right, Steve. He was.
And so Australians may know that because it was sort of an American, no, not sitcom, but a popular program about a Navy patrol boat going through all sorts of hilarious dramas in the South Pacific.
That's right, Stephen. And indeed, there was even a movie made, I think it was Warner Brothers in 1963 called PT-109.
Right.
So, yeah, it has some currency.
And John F. Kennedy was actually on that boat, which is why Hollywood made a story up about it.
He was the commander of that.
He was the commander.
Patrol, PT stands for Patrol Torpedo.
Oh, okay. All right. And he served in the South Pacific region?
In the South Pacific region, in the Solomon Islands, yes.
All right. And this is John F. Kennedy that ended up becoming the President of the United States later on?
It certainly is.
Okay. Well, be a storyteller for me, Brett. How does this guy, he's in the Pacific, something happens and his life is saved by an Australian coast watcher?
Well, what happened, Steve, is that Kennedy and his crew, it was about 2:30 in the morning. It was dark and it was misty. And out of the mist came a Japanese destroyer, smashed, and the destroyer weighs about 40 times what a PT boat. So it was like a truck hitting a billy cart and smashed it in two, killing 2 of Kennedy's crew immediately, and Kennedy and 10 others survived. But all the petrol went up, and those on the destroyer and nearby United States PT boats assumed Kennedy and his crew had all been killed. They all assumed that, and they went their separate ways, and indeed there was even a service held for Kennedy the next day.
Really?
Yeah, a commemorative service was planned.
Assuming he was dead?
Assuming he and indeed his crew were dead. Mm. He then was in the water for about 11 hours, decided with the boat starting to sink, he was holding onto wreckage, he saw a small island and said, well, we have to swim for that island. He swam for it, in fact, holding one of his crewmen by his teeth around his, life vest. And for 4 hours, he gripped him by his teeth, without chipping the famous Kennedy smile, I might add. And yeah, 4 hours, and they swam towards this very small an islet, really, now called Kennedy Island in his honour. They got there, and every one of them got there. It took them, as I say, a bit over 4 hours to get there. And then for the next 3 days, they island hopped. But when the boat was hit by the Japanese destroyer, the aftermath was spotted by an Australian coast watcher, Lt Reg Evans.
Now, let's explain what the coast watchers were doing, please.
What they were doing, in effect, they're intelligence officers. This is before drones and satellites and the rest of it. And so they were behind enemy lines, and they were looking at what Japanese patrol movements were of men and materiel as well as aircraft, and they were reporting back. In effect, they were spies hiding in the jungle.
Yep.
And Evans saw the boat just after the boat was hit, the flames, and he alerted all the Islander scouts to the fact that the Americans, may be missing. 3 days later, two of the scouts saw these bedraggled Americans on an island, just 2 of them. It was Kennedy and one of his crew, and thought, who are they? They were actually scared and went off, bumped into the rest of Kennedy's crew, and from there, when Kennedy came back later that night, saw the islanders with his crew and started to plan the rescue. And then, of course, the coconut becomes the very important part of the story.
Who was Reg Evans? So this guy was a bookkeeper originally.
He was a bookkeeper, but loved the sea and loved the islands. In the 20s, he'd worked in the New Hebrides, which today called Vanuatu, and he could speak the local language, knew the islanders, and that's why when he worked, originally actually served in the artillery in World War II, but then was recruited into the coast watchers in the Navy because of his background, and he could speak pidgin English. So he was a great choice. And not just did he know the islanders, but he was also brave. I mean, it's behind enemy lines, Steve, and if you get caught...
So you've got to be self-reliant, bit of courage.
Bit of courage.
Yeah.
And if you get caught...
not nervy, well, good nerves of steel, I guess.
Nerves of steel.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, because if the Japanese caught you, people always say, will you be killed? Well, you'd be killed, but you'd be tortured first. It was a very hairy operation.
Right. So he was there feeding information back to Australia about what was going on in the South Pacific.
Correct.
Okay.
And there's no question that coast watchers, Evans included, saved many, many lives, but also Admiral Halsey, a US naval admiral, said, that the coast watchers saved Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal saved the Pacific, because it was Australian coast watchers in the north that alerted the United States forces in Guadalcanal that the Japanese were coming en masse, and gave the Americans about 2 hours' notice. And that's because they were in Bougainville, and they, through this chain of radio signals, all around the Pacific, it got back to Guadalcanal, and the Americans were prepared when the Japanese arrived.
The Guadalcanal is still regarded as strategically really vital today. Is that correct?
It is, Steve, it is, because it's between us and the United States.
Okay. All right. So Reg Evans is doing this role. What did he do over that 5-day period that really saved the life of JFK, of John Kennedy?
He alerted the islanders, and then when finally the islanders, he got word back that the islanders had found, these Americans, and he got some of his scouts to go to the island and pick Kennedy up and bring Kennedy back to him.
Right.
And they did, although they arrived late. And Evans was so worried because as he saw the canoe coming towards him towards the beach, he couldn't see a white man on board. There was the islanders. And just as the canoe came on the beach, this skinny, bedraggled, unshaven young American jumped out from under the palm fronds where he'd been hiding. And it was John F. Kennedy. And he said, "Man, am I glad to see you?" And Evans said, "Mate, am I bloody glad to see you?" And then they planned, of course, the escape, the rescue of the rest of his crew.
So they've got to both rescue the rest of the crew, which are scattered, the ones that are alive are scattered around the islands, and avoid the Japanese,
correct,
who would be still patrolling in these areas, looking for them or looking for anyone for that matter.
That's right. And they were always scared because they were really within sight of Japanese encampments. So Evans then had to organise. It's very brave. Kennedy was brave. I mean, there's questions about why he was hit by the destroyer. Perhaps he should have been more alert. But there's no question that when his craft went down, he was very brave. He refused Evans's offer to be, sent back to the American base. He said, "I won't do that, Lieutenant. I won't do that. I want to stay with my crew, and I want to lead the American rescue team to my crewmen," which he did early next morning. He was a very brave man.
Tell me about the coconut, please.
Oh, the coconut. Well, it's before WhatsApp and mobile phones, Steve, so they couldn't contact anyone easily. They had no pen or paper, but they had coconuts. And what happened? One of the islanders said, you have to get a message back. And Kennedy got a coconut at the islander suggestion, and then Kennedy whittled and carved a message to Rendova, which was the US base, about the fact that he was alive and his crew were alive. And so he got the scouts to take it directly to the American base. It's an extraordinary story. It got there, and again, as well as whatever Reg Evans was doing, assisted in the final rescue of Kennedy and his crew. It's an extraordinary story.
All the while under the eye of the Japanese, avoiding the Japanese, hiding from the Japanese, evading the Japanese.
Steve, even when Kennedy was in the canoe coming towards Reg Evans on Gomo Island, and he's been, he's under the palm fronds, they were being spotted by the Japanese aircraft.
Right.
I mean, it was that precarious.
So they knew they were there?
They had an idea that people might be there.
Right, okay. All right.
And so it was a very hairy operation. And so Kennedy, if he'd been seen, well, they all would have been killed.
Okay. What intrigues me is that you go through these life experiences and often you never see the person again, but that wasn't the case. So, take me down the years. John Kennedy, you know, handsome, attractive, going places in United States politics, catches up with Reg Evans later on in life.
That's right. Evans was misremembered by Kennedy. In fact, Kennedy thought he was a New Zealand Army officer.
The ultimate sin.
Yes, the ultimate sin. And in the end, Evans outed himself because, as you're suggesting, he became more and more famous, congressman, senator, and then, of course, running for the presidency, the Democratic nomination. So people thought, who was the bloke that rescued President Kennedy? Finally, Evans outed himself, and he had the evidence because he had his logbooks. And Evans was invited to the White House by President Kennedy on May the 1st, 1961. And you know, he arrived as somewhat of a celebrity into the United States. And just before he arrived, Robert Menzies, our then Prime Minister, met Kennedy for the first time in February of 1961. And Kennedy said to him, "Mr. Prime Minister, in a way, Australia is partly responsible for my administration," because Reg Evans had saved his life.
Yeah. When Reg Evans met Kennedy, do we know much about sort of their conversation or what was said or what happened?
It was half.
Did they go for beers or something?
No, it was half an hour. Okay. 20 minutes in private.
Okay.
Which is a lot. It was Evans recorded that we got the ultimate compliment. We got on like two old cobbers. And I think it's the rescued and the rescuer getting along. And you mentioned before about the coconut. That sat on Kennedy's desk in the Oval Office. In a sense, a talisman of his rise, but also a talisman of the fickleness of fate.
How come I've not heard about this story before?
Well, it's been...
Did you come across it? I mean,
I knew about it.
How can I say it, come across it? It's just such a ripping yarn. I just sort of thought...
It's a great yarn.
Yeah.
And it's a great tale of heroism, both of Evans and the Scouts and also Jack Kennedy, but also about the birth of the Australian-American friendship during the Second World War, in this fair city, in fact, right behind us, Steve, and on the river. I learned about it a while ago. It's been mentioned, but never from really the Australian perspective and how it played such an important part in the development of the relationship and indeed the life and career of Jack Kennedy.
Brett, thanks for telling the story.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Brett Mason. The book is published by New South Publishers. It's called Saving Lieutenant Kennedy, the heroic story of the Australian who helped rescue JFK. Read my mind.
ABC Listen.
You've just missed the story of an Australian hero who helped save the life of a future US president. The book's called Saving Lieutenant Kennedy. Kathy says, I snorkeled around that island 7 years ago. I knew about JFK, but not in such detail, says Kathy of 8 Mile Plains. And Peter Racy says the coconut is still in the Jack Kennedy Library in the United States, and the book had a copy of it presented to the Queensland Naval Association. The American ambassador Caroline Kennedy spoke at it. Apparently happened about 6 or 7 weeks ago, so there you go.